Hello, everyone. This is Pelin Oğuz. I'd like to welcome you all to our program that we organize as Istanbul Policy Center, Sabancı University, Stiftung Mercator Initiative, in collaboration with Medyascope. And today in our program, we're going to talk about the war in Ukraine, or maybe put it as the Putin's war in Ukraine and the new global order. And today is the 29th day of the first attack of Russia to Ukraine. It's been almost a month. And to everybody's surprise, this offense on Ukraine has lasted this long. And also there is a unique occasion that West has unified against Russia with firm sanctions within this conflict. And we also see a resistance within Ukraine under the leadership of Volodymyr Zelensky. And we will see how long the unification and the firm stance of the West is going to continue and how the war is going to evolve. We will see all this. And also today's summits, the EU summit, G7 and NATO, also may put further sanctions on Russia. The humanitarian aspect of the war is, of course, heartbreaking. There has been many consequences after the war within Russia and also in Ukraine. Many people have died, hundreds of civilians have died, many thousands of soldiers have died, more were injured, and 4 million people have escaped from Ukraine. And many people also are internally displaced within Ukraine. And these numbers keep getting higher and higher. And of course, there is a spillover effects of this war in every country. So we are going to talk about, we have been also in our programs, we have been talking about this war from many different aspects. But today we want to bring in also the Russian perspective. And we have we are very lucky to have a guest as such today. We have Michael Thumann with us today. Michael Thumann was our 2019-20 Mercator IPC Senior Fellow. He's a very experienced journalist, also who has a great experience on Russia, Central Asia, Turkey, and the Middle East. So we are very lucky to have such an insider opinion and views within this program with Michael Thumann today. Let me introduce him very shortly. He has been a foreign affairs correspondent of Die Zeit, a German newspaper in Moscow, since 2021. He has been working with Die Zeit since 2013 as a diplomatic correspondent. And he previously reported on Turkey and the Middle East as Die Zeit's Istanbul bureau chief. And also he has reported on Russia, Central Asia as the Moscow bureau chief of Die Zeit in the years of 2014-15, and also earlier in between the years 1996 and 2001. So he has a very great experience within that region and insights also for that region as well. So thank you very much, Michael, for joining us today within our program. It's great to have you.
Thank you very much, Pelin. I'm very happy to be with you. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Thank you. Maybe we can start a little bit from the beginning of the conflict to understand a little bit further the Russian perspective. I want to ask you this question. What is Vladimir Putin's motivation in this offense towards Ukraine? To what extent Putin's personality and his reading of history plays a role, and maybe his aspirations playing a role in this offense?
I think you touched on the main motivation already, and I think it is history, and it is his place in history, because we can go on and think about all kinds of possible considerations. Might there be any resources in Ukraine? Might there be any geopolitical considerations, or Russia moving further to the west and gaining more territory? in a pivotal region or control of grain exports or something. I think all of this does not really apply and really explain the motivation of Vladimir Putin. Putin sees himself not in the league of temporary personalities such as Joe Biden or the new German Chancellor Scholz, who is he, or anybody else. He is in the league of eternal Russian leaders of Piotr I, Peter the Great, and Joseph Stalin, and personalities, Russian leaders who were able to enlarge the Russian territory, to control enormous masses of land in Eurasia. And this is a mission he deems himself to be on since the start. He has consolidated the Russian territory through the war in Chechnya. He has waged other wars, small scale, controllable wars, as I would put it, in the Russian neighborhood. And now this is basically his masterpiece to bring back Ukraine into under the control of Moscow. For this, he has written extensively extensive historical analyses, all of them, I think, wrong from the very beginning, with very few grains of truth in there, but that is his worldview. And if we want to understand his mission and why he is actually moving in, despite all the many possible arguments against it, from a Russian realpolitik point of view, because he is basically violating all kinds of realpolitik considerations which a Russian leader could have here. We have to understand this mission he is on, and we have to understand it also in the context, of course, of his personal nationalism, the ideology he adopted 10 years ago.
Thank you very much, Michael. And you also have been working as our senior fellow when you were in Istanbul. You were doing research on your book, Nationalism by Choice, which is now published. Also, I would like to mention that book. Maybe if you have the book with you, you can show the German version.
Yeah, it's always with me, almost always.
Great. Okay.
That is the German version. Yeah.
It's not in English yet, but within this book, you were talking about Putin and Erdogan and the similarities in between. Also, some other leaders who are having these authoritarian tendencies. So we can see that Putin's reading of history and the idea of nationalism also plays a role in his acts towards Ukraine. And in terms of trying to understand it from his perspective, how does he see the West when he looks at the West? What is the role that he wants to have towards the West? What is he trying to prove maybe against the West?
I think that his perception of the West, there is a continuity and there is a change which occurred a little more than 10 years ago. Let's start with the continuity. The continuity, he always perceived the West as an adversary. He basically comes from a Soviet framed vision of the West as an entity which fought against the Soviet Union, which basically dealt the biggest blow to Russia as he sees it, or as he coined it once, the biggest catastrophe of the 20th century, the dissolution of the Soviet Union in December 1991. So, and I think he never lost that kind of thinking that the West is the main adversary. But there were periods of cooperation, I believe, when he thought it was right to cooperate. And that was in the early 2000s when Putin was still very much of a a pragmatist, somebody who was jiggling around with different topics, with different approaches, and also with ideologies. So at the time in the early 2000s, he thought there could be a bridge of cooperation in the anti-terror war. And so he was very disappointed, in fact, that this strategy didn't work out, and that George W. Bush surprised him and many others, of course, the leaders of Turkey and Germany and France and others, with the invasion in Iraq. And I think the invasion in Iraq basically changed his calculation that there was room for significant cooperation with the West. But there was another factor which was much more important for him, which changed his perception of the West. And this is, from a Western perspective or from a general perspective, is less understandable. And this is his obsession with movements, with people's movements, with public protest, demonstrations. So he sees everything that happens since 2002, 3, and 4, the Velvet Revolution in Georgia, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the ensuing revolutions in the Middle East. He sees all that as the work of the CIA or Western agencies, and somehow the Americans being behind that. I think this is a thought which is not very alien to maybe some also in the Turkish government or in other governments, that the US is behind all of that. I was, as a reporter, on the spot in Georgia and in Ukraine in 2004 and 2014, and I can tell you that I didn't detect many agents there or something, but I detected many people who were actually very sincere in their protest, and they had very much reason to protest. So these people's movements, he never understood that as a Soviet styled bureaucrat and agent that he is, obviously. But this changed his perception entirely, because he thought they are after me. And this kind of paranoia with every movement, and we saw the Arab upheavals, that he thought, okay, now I'm the next in line. And there was actually something where he was, I think it was never that threatening for him, but there were the Bolotnaya protests in Moscow, in the center of Moscow, not far from the Kremlin, in 2011 and 12, when he moved back to the chair of the president. He was prime minister for 4 years before, as we remember. And these protests he saw as instigated by the United States. And this was the moment when things really changed with him, when he thought, well, I am losing I'm losing support here in my own country, and the US is taking advantage of that. And in fact, his popularity at the time was very low, well below 50. So really alarming for a leader in a non-democratic, or at the time hybrid system. So he needed to do something about his rating and to put him safely back into the chair of the president. And that was the very moment when he adopted nationalism as an ideology. He was not a nationalist before. He actually criticized nationalism before, but that was the moment when he also wrote about that extensively. At the time, he discovered his love for long historical articles, nationalist articles, at the time 10 years ago. And since then, we have that very strong dichotomy. He then, in another stage, he had a problem with NATO slightly before, as we learned in 2007 on the Munich Security Conference, but then he also detected the EU as an adversary, which came as a surprise to many Russians and Europeans as well. But this is all to be explained by his nationalist turn, which is still a main motivation today, and which I think he has developed and in which he has radicalized a lot.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, we can maybe talk about a bit more of how the Western reaction towards him was recognized by him, his perception of Western reaction. Maybe he miscalculated that there was going to be this much of unification, but we can talk about this in a little bit. I want to ask you a little bit more about Russia. And since you just were in Russia, you just came back to Berlin after the war, can you tell us your experience in Russia and how everything was unfolding? And we see many protests within Russia. We don't see them from general media anymore because all the media is blocked and under the surveillance of Putin at the moment. So there's not much information coming out. But can you tell us your experience before you are coming to Berlin from Moscow?
Yeah, well, we have in Moscow since a year, we've seen a steady growth of repression and a general tendency to quell all public opinion, basically, which is not in line with the official point of view. And this, of course, has been triggered in the beginning of 2021 with the return of Alexei Navalny, a politician who clearly had both the stamina and I'd say also the possible popularity with some populist elements in it to challenge Mr. Putin. And since then, we see that repression, that wave of repression, and it resulted, I think, in the second half of the year in a very efficient strategy to keep the Russians and most parts of the elite in doubt about what was really happening with these very strange troop movements around Ukraine. And everybody, and be it critics of Putin or be it supporters of Putin, everybody was convinced that these were basically exercises and troop movements to put pressure on the West and to coerce the West into kind of to get compromises and to coerce the West into accommodating his demands of withdrawal and never ever NATO membership for Ukraine and so on. It didn't turn out that way. And he surprised most Russians, and I think he probably also surprised a great deal of the general staff and his own entourage, some of whom did not even know how to frame what he was up to. We saw the Security Council meeting shortly before the war, where the chief of foreign intelligence was somehow desperately trying to express what Putin actually meant, and Putin corrected him in front of the cameras. So, and I think this is very telling about the general development in Russia, that it is really a one-man rule, that we do not face a collective apparatus like in the Soviet Union, or that we have different pillars of power, and here would be the security ministries and there the army and so on. But all power indeed is concentrated in this one man. And this, I think, is also a significant change first of all, in Russia, but it's also a significant difference to neighboring countries, because we see a general tendency towards populism, authoritarian populism, nationalism all over the region. But I think Russia is example to Turkey, and I think also at the IPC and in different programs we have done lots of comparisons of populism, this and that, and but I think there's no comparison anymore, because this is actually quite unique what's happening now in Moscow.
What about the public opinion towards the war in Moscow? Well, what can you say about that at the moment?
There is an optimistic and a pessimistic look at that. So let's start with the pessimistic part, which is that if you look at public polls, government-controlled polls, but they are very similar to the only remaining pollster, independent pollster Levada, that roughly 70% support President Putin in this operation, and that also roughly, and that is a state-controlled pollster said that also 70% support the war, or they of course say operation. You must not say war, because it's just an operation to clean the Nazis in Kiev. That's the reading of the state propaganda and Putin. So, and that is that gives you the picture in general in Russia, and also this number of 70% roughly coincides with the number of the Russian population which consumes mostly or only TV as a main source of information. And TV, of course, is fully controlled. So you would hear, when you speak to people, you would hear actually the same phrases you have heard on state TV the night before, which is a bit frightening, because the people seem to be entirely brainwashed. If they repeat again over and again the same phrases, or actually new phrases which have been invented, in the last main propaganda show on Sunday night of Dmitry Kiselyov, and then 2 days later you would speak to a taxi driver and he would also then repeat Dmitry Kiselyov. It's quite amazing. So let's talk about and that's the optimistic part, about the 30% who do not agree. Of course, you have some undecided, and you have, but you have roughly 25% who do not support the war, but who at the same time would not be ready to go in the street, because you may pay a very high price for that, but who would simply disagree, and who disagree entirely with Putin. And it is very the undecided, whom I mentioned, it's a very small percentage. It is basically a very divided society in that aspect, with an overwhelming majority, of course, but you have this solid 20-25% who are against Putin and his policies, and who are also against the war. Now, the protests you've mentioned, there are protests, but on a very limited scale. And sometimes people do amazing things, like they also did in the Soviet Union. Sometimes they go out with a poster, with a blank poster. There's nothing on it, and they get arrested for that. And I think that's a very sophisticated way of protesting, because everything, you don't need to say it. Everything is clear if you hold your poster like that, a blank sheet. And the amazing thing about that is that also I witnessed in my neighborhood in Moscow, I witnessed some protests like in Belarus in the past in the past year, that there were small groups of mostly young people, and they would gather and then shout no to the war, and then they would disappear after 10 minutes. So the police couldn't go after them. But so all of this you have, and you have it not only in Moscow, but also in bigger cities all over the country.
But many people are trying to stay away from streets in order to stay away from persecution, because there are many sanctions, and they cannot even say a war. They have to say operation. So they have to go along, and some of them can't, and some of them are now fleeing the country and not staying in Russia anymore. So they are trying to find ways to get out of Russia, as far as we have heard. Maybe we can talk about the Western reaction towards the war, because in the beginning, the first few days, everybody thought that this was going to be a small operation, maybe even, and then it became a full-fledged war. But the West became united very pretty quickly, that no one was expecting that they could do this. But they came with firm sanctions towards Russia, and now they're trying to increase these sanctions. How do you see this reaction of the West towards Russia? How do you evaluate this? Do you think that this is they will continue to hold this together, or this even at the end will result in will have some results in ending the war? How do you see their reaction?
Well, first of all, it is in fact, and so Putin surprised many Russians and surprised many people in the world, and the West surprised itself. The West surprised the West in this kind of unified reaction. And actually, since 2016, we didn't think that this was possible anymore. So we see it is possible, and of course, Putin did not choose the right moment to split the West. We have to say he could have done things when Donald Trump was still in office, or in the transition time or something. But he did it now, and plus he does it in a time when President Biden is in an election year, and so the midterms, of course, will be decisive for his next for the rest of his term, and I think he will do everything for a good performance. And a good performance in this view, and in his view, of course, is a firm stance towards Putin and towards aggression and war crimes, as he said. But the question, of course, is why, all of Europe, the 27, and then take the former 28, the Brits, they are all on board. And you don't see much deviation, with a little exception of Viktor Orban, who always speaks loud and then falls in line if there is, if they have to vote in the EU Council. And I think this is to be explained by the kind of enormous wake-up call Putin triggered there. And it is, and also here I'd like to mention my own country, which has a very strong economic relationship with Russia, which has this energy relationship with Russia. And we call it with a name which is difficult to translate into English, so it also becomes a kind of German word in English. Zeitenwende, we call it, and Zeitenwende is basically a change of an era, a sea change, whatever you may call it, resulted in a very different attitude towards armament and the German army, and the way how we see Russia. And not as a partner anymore, but as an adversary, destabilizing Europe and actually trying to put the tables upside down and threatening the European order of peace. And so this threat perception, I think, has led to this unified response of the West. And the West surprised itself, I think, in the amount of sanctions and the massive sanctions. There were suggestions from here and there and there. And in the end, they said, we take all of that instead of selecting carefully like we did in 2014 and 15. But it was all of that, and there will be more on top. And now we, of course, face a test. And this test is on the table now when President Biden comes to Brussels, and they will discuss the new sanctions and also the response, obviously, to Putin's latest move, which is all contracts on gas and oil deliveries to Europe are in dollars. Some have it in euros, but it is in Western currency, euro or dollars. And that is in the contract. Putin now wants to introduce a law that all oil and gas imports, exports have to be paid in rubles. And thus he wants to force the West to undercut the own sanctions and buy rubles, stabilize the ruble, and buy rubles with the central bank of Russia, which has been also put under sanctions. Or face or put the West in the predicament that they themselves have to cut the import of oil and gas. So the response will be very interesting. I cannot, it's very risky always to predict things, and then I will be seen here the day after tomorrow and I'd be all wrong. But let me be honest, I'd be surprised if the West gave in to that, and if my own government, the Germans, if they said, okay, we'll now from now on pay in rubles and buy rubles with the Russian central bank. I can't possibly imagine that, even if it's very difficult for Germany, because we have a strong dependence. It's over 50% of German gas comes from Russia. And the German foreign minister has been very active in the past weeks to actually explore new sources and to buy LNG here and there and to sign new contracts on that. But I think this will be also a test for the unity of Europe and the US, and especially the US, which is less threatened by all these questions because they are themselves a gas exporting country. And of course, precisely this, the question of American gas exports to Europe will be very important in the wake of Putin's decision to sell gas for rubles.
How long would this firmly continue is one of the questions. And also when this continues in such a way and the sanctions increase, Russia is now being isolated diplomatically, economically, and so it seems like Putin is like cornered or like put against the wall. And do you think that this is going to push him? Is he on the verge of a point of no return? Because like on Tuesday, he was saying that he was going to, the Kremlin spokesman was actually saying that in the time of an existential threat, nuclear arms can be used. Would this be possible, do you think, when Russia is that much in the corner feeling threatened? Or what is an existential threat for Russia? How do they feel existentially threatened?
Well, I think that for Putin, what is very important now is to bring home a victory in Ukraine. To bring it home by all means. He must not lose this war, because I said in the beginning, this is basically his masterpiece of war, and that is why he needs to, and his popularity depends on that, his standing his place in history and all what's important for him. So and that is why I believe the point of he has already passed this point of no return. So it is very difficult for him to conclude some kind of ceasefire now, or to, I think he's playing around with that, and he might consider a ceasefire for a short period of time as a breathing space, basically, then and to move on a bit later to accomplish his mission. But I believe he wants to control Ukraine with Ukrainians or without Ukrainians. He wants to grab the land, and he wants to have a ceremony in Kiev, and moving into Kiev and visiting the Saint Sophia Cathedral and all of that. I mean, all pictures and symbolism we have seen every time and again in the 20th century, when in the century of conquest, so to speak, in Europe. But
do you think he wants to conquer Ukraine and impose a new government in Ukraine under his control, or he wants to control Ukraine with Zelensky and the current government?
I think he doesn't want to cooperate with Zelensky. Zelensky, the Ukrainian Jew being labeled a Nazi by the Russians, he is somebody who is entirely unacceptable, specifically because he has risen to such a stance on a world stage as an international hero and as an idol and star with the youth, and very much in contrast to this hypochondriac Putin, who is apparently afraid of every virus possibly being in the air thrown around, that he couldn't put up with such a Ukrainian president, even under his, and I think also Zelensky would not submit to him. He also has strong limits to what he can do. I rather think of either some kind, he will try to install some kind of leadership which is friendly to. I don't think he will pull out of the closet good old Yanukovych, the prime minister who was toppled in the Maidan uprising in 2014, who was a pro-Russian president, but he will invent some person, and not necessarily one of the before mentioned persons by the British intelligence agencies and so on. It can be anybody, but he must be 100% loyal. The question, of course, is how to control such a vast country, because he has, of course, underestimated the national feelings, and the fact that Ukraine indeed is an independent national state with an independent national tradition and a very strong national feeling. And this feeling is not only confined to those mainly Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians in the West, but to Russian-speaking. This is what the Russians do not understand, that somebody has Russian as a native language and still is a Ukrainian patriot. And we as Germans can't be mistaken about that, because we have Switzerland and most Swiss speak German, but they do not feel German at all. And I mean, this is something what you have to put up with, and rather being, happy about that somebody speaks also your native language in a neighboring country. I think that's a nice thing to have, but Putin thinks, okay, then they are ours, which is where he has miscalculated. So, but you asked me, is he getting into a corner? I think he is not in the corner yet. And he has very much control about what is being channeled back to Russia, about all the way the war goes. I mean, the Russians hear only about successes and triumphs, and this is all a small operation. It will be all over in a couple of weeks. So he is in control of that. That is for him the main issue. But he might get into a corner if it doesn't get to an end in a certain period of time, and or even if the war turns, or if it reaches its point of culmination, as the German war theoretician Clausewitz has coined it, that is the point where an offense gets stalled, and then you would have a backlash, and the backlash is twice as strong as the offense. So if we get to such a point, then I think he gets into a corner in which he then might resort to weapons of mass destructions. The Americans already have tipped at possible use of chemical weapons. We have seen already there is evidence that phosphor bombs and all kinds of cluster ammunition has been used already. So all weapons and ammunitions banned by international law. But he might then go on to use biological or chemical weapons in order to coerce and to terrorize the population into surrender. Or he might also test, he has a huge nuclear arsenal. He doesn't just need to launch the big one, but he, of course, has tactical nuclear weapons. So he can use them in the war theater, also in order to disseminate terror. And so that I see as being in the corner and using these weapons. The question then is, what will be the Western reaction? And President Biden obviously has now set up a team to check different options and ponder options of possible reactions to such an escalation of the war.
Yes, it's really interesting how this war is going to end, because even if the war continues, if it continues even for longer, then it means that the victory is getting far away from Putin. And even if, as you were saying, he manages to put a friendly government intact in Ukraine, who is going to be under the influence of Russia, it's hard to maintain that government because the Russian money or the troops are not going to be enough to maintain that stability in the region, because of these Ukrainian sentiments that you're talking about, these nationalistic sentiments within Ukrainians. Even it is now increasing. Even the formation of nation itself is reoccurring with this war, with an external threat. So it's really hard these are very different questions. It's hard to answer all these questions, how this war is going to end. But I want to ask one last question.
Can I just add one thing to your thought? Because I think here we are at a very interesting point. It shows basically that with the 19th or 20th century thinking, I conquer a land and then I install a friendly government and control it, that these things do not work that way anymore in the 21st century. You have these huge cities. How do you conquer Kiev with its more than 3 million inhabitants? Now, they have failed at Kharkiv already, with its more than 1 million, and there are several big cities in Ukraine with more than 1 million or 2 millions. And basically, armies have become much smaller. Russia doesn't have the 2 million soldier army of the Soviet Union anymore. They have an army of 900,000, but actually they have in the theater they can put up to 300,000, and half of that is already in the field and is suffering heavy losses. So, and this tells us a lot about what is doable under today's circumstances with the different changing societies. And if you want to conquer a country for good, which is a country of its own with a strong national sentiment and huge million cities, that is a thing which is impossible to do. And I'm very curious, just, you know, as an analyst and historian, you know, how this thing will work out in the end, you know, because this is a turning point, and we will see from that, and we will learn from that a lot, apart from all the terrible atrocities I'm afraid we'll see. Sorry for interrupting.
No. Thank you very much for this points. I have so many other questions, but we don't have that much time. Maybe one last question, or maybe something that you would like to add at the end. I will give you some time. What do you think this all means for like all this region, for the all ex-Soviet states, ex-Soviet states, and also in order for Putin to have some kind of a maneuvering area, what is the relation with Russia is going to, how is it going to take place? If you have comments on that.
I think it's terrible news for the post-Soviet space. It is, I mean, we had preceding the war on Ukraine, we had the upheaval in Kazakhstan, which started as an inter-elite struggle and ended with the Russian intervention and the support, but it was basically the Russian support for Tokayev, the president, against the old president Nazarbayev. But of course, Tokayev is entirely in line, and Kazakhstan is not that strong, independent, proud country anymore as it had been until December 2021. It's a sad story of national decay, of course. And it is also, likewise, it is a strong signal to other countries in the post-Soviet space not to deviate too much from the line, or to give the impression that you would be a close ally of the US and now also of the EU for that matter. And it puts particularly, I'd like to highlight here, two countries which are at imminent danger, I think, which is Georgia and which is Moldova. Moldova, which is overwhelmingly with pro-Western, Western-educated leaders, but a divided country, because you have also a strong Western pro-Moscow party in the country, and you have Transnistria, of course, as a separatist entity controlled by the Russian army. And Georgia being in the Caucasus and basically cornered, and with Ukraine, if Ukraine becomes Russian controlled, if it becomes, then Georgia will lose this bridge basically towards Europe, puts them also in a precarious situation. So I think this, they were all alarmed 2014-15 about the annexation of Crimea. Nazarbayev of Kazakhstan at the time was critical and uneasy. Even Lukashenko of Belarus was uneasy. But Belarus now is basically part of the enlarged Russian space, and Lukashenko, not the country, not the people, but Lukashenko is under Putin's control. So what we actually see here is a consolidation of the post-Soviet space by Russia by force, and this is bad news for more independently minded countries like Georgia and Moldova, and was before.
Okay, thank you very much. We have more to talk, but our time is up. Thank you very much for joining us today in our program, Michael Thumann. We hope to see you in other programs as well. And also we'd like to thank our viewers, and we will see you next week with a different topic. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
Thank you very much. Great pleasure.
Thank you.